Nerve cells, of course, do not work in isolation. To organize even the simplest functions, they must assemble into chains and networks. Just look at an image, just the simplest example of a neural network. It is enough to remember that dendrites receive information and axons transmit it in order to determine the direction in which signals travel through network. Neurons in a neural network can be divided into four functional groups. Neurons located at the input of the network are usually connected to the sense organs. They are called sensory neurons. They detect touch, perceive smells, and distinguish temperature. They help us perceive the surrounding world. Neurons located at the output are motor neurons and autonomic neurons. Motor neurons initiate muscle contraction. Any movement of the hands, a blink, or pressing a button on a laptop begins with an impulse that arises in motor neurons. Autonomic neurons work with internal organs such as the heart, blood vessels, intestines, bronchi. The main difference between motor and autonomic neurons is that we can control the former. We press a key on the keyboard by our own will. Autonomic neurons, as a rule, are beyond voluntary control. We cannot change the heart rate by sheer force of thought, unless, of course, we are 100-year-old yogi from Nepal. This may seem unfair. Why not give us access to controlling all the systems of the body? But evolution placed a veto on entry to this part of neural network for a reason. If we recall the analogy between the brain and the computing center, our consciousness turns out to be a user who constantly interacts with thousands of computers. Some of them it can control, others it merely sees online and can tell that they are working, but it has no password to make changes to the system. For example, our heart beats at a certain rate. We can measure the pulse, but without biofeedback or decades of yoga practice, a person cannot slow it down or speed it up through sheer willpower. Finally, in our computing center, there are processing units that are clearly doing something, yet consciousness is completely unaware of the specifics of their activity. This applies, for example, to hormone secretion. This function is managed by a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Our consciousness, that is, the centers of the cerebral cortex, does not track this process at all. Take growth hormone. It is released under the control of the already mentioned hypothalamus. No one, not even the most enlightened yogi, has ever managed to grow even 10 centimeters through willpower alone. The existence of such computers, hidden from consciousness, is due to the fact that these brain systems are responsible for processes so vital that the user simply must not interfere, or else one could disrupt the entire system. We can primarily control movements, thoughts, and to some extent emotions. But direct access by consciousness to the autonomic sphere is extremely limited. The neural network also contains intermediate nerve cells, so-called interneurons. In this ensemble, they play the leading role. They determine whether an incoming signal will be passed further to the output, and whether, for example, a touch will trigger a response. Interneurons make the decision to initiate a reaction, and they are also responsible for such thing as memory. It is precisely these cells that are present in the greatest numbers and that connect inputs and outputs. In a complex brain such as the human one, about 95% of neurons are intermediate, while no more than 5% are input and output neurons. For example, those that receive external signals or initiate movements. This means that information processing is the main occupation of our brain. That's why we call it a processor. Intermediate cells exchange information, forming information flows that are complex, interesting, and unpredictable. That is why our brain is compared not to an ordinary computer, but to a noisy one. In a conventional computer, 5 times 5 always equals 25. In the brain, the result may be 24 and sometimes 27. And that is correct. The brain is supposed to be noisy. It must generate behavior that is, to a certain degree, stochastic, that is, random. This is evolutionary advantageous. If a hare always fled from a fox in a predictable way, for example, strictly in a straight line, it would quickly be caught and eaten. What matters is a certain degree of chaos in its movements. Sometimes it runs to the right, sometimes to the left, moves in zigzags, jumps over bushes. This is biologically sound and gives it a chance to survive. In the end, our brain is not designed to work with precise numbers like a computer. Its task is to try to predict the future and to diversify our behavior in such a way that it can satisfy its needs and survive.